All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're very happy to have you here. My name is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs here at Village Preservation. We're very happy that you're joining us for this presentation by Bill V. Mullen on his book, James Baldwin, Living in Fire. Before I hand it over to Bill, let me just tell you a little bit about Village Preservation if you are unfamiliar with us. We were founded back in 1980, and we work to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've secured landmark designation for more than 1,250 buildings, and we host over 75 free programs like this throughout the year. We are a membership-based organization, so your support is critical in helping us do the work that we do. If you see that QR code on your screen, please take a moment to scan it and consider giving us a donation, or better yet, becoming a member of Village Preservation. I also highly recommend, please go to villagepreservation.org. You'll be able to learn about all the advocacy work that we do, and we have an enormous number of free resources, whether you're a member or not, available for you to use, from historic maps and the entire collection of landmark designation reports from around the city. So definitely please consider giving us a donation or thinking about becoming a member, but also please head to villagepreservation.org to look up our upcoming programs. Tomorrow evening, we have When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion with Julie Sato at 6 p.m. So if you have not yet registered for that program, please consider doing so. Head over to villagepreservation.org and sign up for that Zoom presentation there. Now, speaking of Zoom, just some quick Zoom protocols. Everyone's video will be off and you will be muted through the entire evening, but please continue to use the chat and the Q&A feature to drop comments and questions. We always love having your questions, and please feel free to drop those into the Q&A at any time during Bill's presentation. So now let me go ahead and introduce Bill. Bill Mullen is Professor of English and American Studies at Purdue University. His books include Un-American, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Century of World Revolution, W.E.B. Du Bois, Revolutionary Across the Color Line, Afro-Orientalism, a study of interethnic and anti-racist alliance between Asian and African Americans, and Popular Front's Chicago and African American Cultural Politics, 1935 to 1946. But tonight, Bill is joining us to talk about James Baldwin. Bill, a very hearty welcome to you.
Thank you so much, William, and thanks all of you for coming. I'm just so delighted and honored to be here. Let me start by saying happy birthday, James Baldwin. His birthday was Friday, August 2nd. This is his centennial, and I'm just thrilled to be able to share my own perspectives on the life and work and art of this extraordinary person tonight. I'm really honored to be asked by Village Preservation. I really respect the work that you all do. Actually, in New York City, you've been one of the leading organizations to recognize Baldwin's legacy. And I want to start with an image tonight in my PowerPoint of 81 Horatio Street, which was the place that Baldwin lived for about 4 years, from 1957 to 61. And later on in the presentation, I'll show you a historic plaque, which Village Preservation has put up there to commemorate Baldwin's place and time in the village. I want to just kind of wrap my comments around a sort of theme tonight. I'm going to talk about James Baldwin, the village, meaning Greenwich Village, exile, and the world. And James Baldwin was a person who embraced the idea of exile. And what I mean by that is at different stages of his life, he felt forced to move and leave and enter new spaces and new terrains. And he did it sometimes voluntarily, and he did it sometimes involuntarily. And tonight I want to talk about how his move from Harlem to the Greenwich Village when he was about 19 years old in 1943 was the beginning of an exploration of the idea of living a life of sort of slow exile. It opened the door for him to then move subsequently to Paris, Istanbul, and other parts of the world. So in a certain way, Greenwich Village for me is a gateway not only to like Baldwin's actual explorations of the terrain of the world, but the concept of living outside of one's national boundaries and national homeland, an experience which he said actually profoundly helped him to understand what it was to be an American. And that's a huge theme in a lot of his essays, for those of you who I suspect have read them. So I'll ask William if you could go to the next slide and I'll begin. So Baldwin was born in 1924 in Harlem, to a very poor working class family. His father wanted him to be a preacher. By the time he finished high school, that's what he thought he was going to do, or I should say, while he was going through high school in Harlem. Um, when he graduated high school, he made two huge decisions in his life. One is that he broke with that ambition his father had for him to be a preacher, and the second one is he moved out of Harlem to sustain himself, to find work, and eventually in 1943 to move to Greenwich Village. It was all for Baldwin really about trying to find himself as a writer. He went to DeWitt Clinton High School in New York City. He worked for the literary magazine there, which is called The Magpie. He was writing poetry and short stories. He was desperate to kind of test himself as a writer. And moving to the village, he thought was the place that he could perhaps pursue that most vigilantly. And one of the first people he met in the village was a man named Beaufort Delaney, who's pictured here. Beaufort Delaney was a painter originally from Tennessee, who came to New York City about 1929 via Boston. He was a modernist artist. He was an extraordinary painter. He was also a profound aesthetic philosopher. And he took Baldwin in. He was gay, he was Black. He was, for Baldwin, the first example he saw of what it could mean for him as a young gay Black man to kind of embody that role of the artist. And he talks in his writings about Delaney about two things. He said, Delaney taught me how to see. He taught me how to appreciate light. He taught me how to develop an optics onto the world and to see beneath the surface of things. And all of those are skills that you can, appreciate when you read Baldwin's writing, which is very textured and very beautiful, and very optically rich. And the second thing Delaney introduced him to was Black music. Baldwin had grown up mainly in the church, a Pentecostal church, where he sang in the choir. Delaney had a huge record collection of people like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald and bebop artists. And Baldwin's ears exploded. And if you read all of Baldwin's work, there's constant references to music, Black music and the Black musical tradition. He basically said that the Black writer is in that same tradition of creative arts that the Black musician inhabits. Two of his later books, Tell Me How Long the Train Has Been Gone and Just Above My Head, are literally copped from pop songs, which he fancied. So Delaney was both a role model, an inspiration, a mentor, and he kind of convinced Baldwin that you can do this. You can actually pursue the life of an artist and a writer at a time when he really, really needed that example. And I put by the way, Delaney's residence and studio at 181 Green Street, unfortunately, is no longer there, but I put it there for those of you who are Greenwich Villagers who might know the general location where Delaney lived. Next slide. This is one of the earliest visual portrait of James Baldwin by Delaney in 1944. He would have been 20 years old when he sat for this. Delaney did several portraits of Baldwin. He was a portrait artist who began as a realist and then moved into a slightly more expressionistic mode of writing, or painting, which in some ways also parallels Baldwin's own development as an artist. And I'll come back and talk about that a little later. But you can get a sense, I wanted to share this because I think it's one of the nicest portraits of Baldwin as a young man, or the portrait of the artist as a young man. Baldwin was a big fan of James Joyce. But it kind of it connected the two of them. They remained friends the rest of their lives until Delany eventually died of Alzheimer's in his late 70s. And right to that moment, even though he was still living in Paris at the time, Baldwin was intimately connected with every aspect of Delany's life. And Delany has happily had a kind of renaissance of interest himself. His paintings weren't widely known in the 40s and the 50s, which had to do with kind of racism in the art market. His work is now collected in some of the major museums in the world, including this piece. Next slide. Baldwin was really broke when he got to the village. He had a hard time holding down jobs. He worked at a factory on Canal Street. He worked at a industrial plant in New Jersey during the war. He ended up working as a waiter, partly by the recommendation of Beaufort Delany, at a place called the Calypso, which is a really, really important landmark social club in the village at 147 McDougal Street, owned and operated by Connie Williams, who was the woman seated there playing the maracas. Connie Williams was a Trinidadian immigrant to the United States who opened this fabulous cafe, which had nightly live music and entertainment. It became a hothouse for Black intellectuals and leftists in the village in the period of the 1940s. It's one reason Baldwin wanted to be there. He met some really extraordinary people there. He met Alain Locke, who was one of the architects of the Harlem Renaissance. He met Claude McKay, who was a Jamaican poet who had immigrated about 1915 and stayed in the U.S. He immersed himself even further in Black and Caribbean music. There's rumors, I haven't been able to substantiate them, that Baldwin actually took a turn singing one night at the Calypso. He wasn't a great singer, but he gave it a try. And the experience of being at the Calypso, I think, also informed settings for his other books. One of them is Another Country, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But another is a really extraordinary story, which I highly recommend, called Sonny's Blues, which was a story about two brothers, one of whom is a horn player and a heroin addict. And much of the story takes place in a music club, including these kind of heartbreaking crescendo scenes of one brother watching the other perform. Baldwin never kind of left the Black musical social sphere as a place of writing and thinking. When he was in Paris, he was also quite active in the nightlife and the clubs. It's a shame the Calypso's not here anymore, but I'll have a little bit more to say about it. But it was a tremendously influential place for him, again, sort of aspiring to immerse himself in Black art and Black intellectual life as it existed in the village. Next slide. So I kind of boldly want to claim here that two of Baldwin's novels, neither of which is actually set in Greenwich Village, can be read as Greenwich Village novels. The one on the left, his first book, is called Go Tell It on the Mountain. I hope a lot of you have read it. It's an incredible coming of age story, or Bildungsroman, as we like to call it. It's really about a young man named John Grimes growing up in Harlem, very much like Baldwin, with a very overbearing father who really wants him to become a preacher. And the book ends with John both rejecting this life of preacherhood and sort of symbolically letting the reader know that he's going to set out for the territory. He's going to break from his family. He's going to break from the church, and he's going to go off somewhere. And this finale to the novel is also punctuated by this extraordinary homoerotic scene between John and another young boy in the chorus. And Baldwin is clearly signaling to us by the time he finishes Go Tell It on the Mountain who he is and where he's going. And so I sort of suggest that when I read the novel, I kind of feel like the page after the last page will be James Baldwin in the Village. And that book was published in 1953. So it's actually written after he's spent some time in the village. He's in Paris, in fact, when the book gets published. but I believe it loops back to that transitional moment where he goes from Harlem to the village. And the second, which is really an incredible classic of gay and lesbian writing in the United States, is Giovanni's Room, published in 1956. This book is so interesting. It's set in France. It's about a gay I won't call it an interracial relationship. It's a relationship between a white American man named David and an Italian named Giovanni. And the reason I speak of it as a village novel is that several of the anecdotes and storylines in Giovanni's Room were drawn from his experience as a young gay man in the village. He talks about having a relationship with a young Italian boy, for example, while he's in Greenwich Village before he leaves for Paris. So he lives in the village, he goes to Paris, he writes Giovanni's Room, but I think it can be read as a kind of reflection on the life experiences that prepared him to write Giovanni's Room, which in 1956 was absolutely groundbreaking. I mean, there were just not people writing openly gay books at that time period. And it was a bit of a shocker for people because Go Tell It All in the Mountain was not an openly queer novel. Even his publishers said to Baldwin, don't write Giovanni's Room, it's going to get you in trouble. But he did it because he absolutely had to. And I feel like he was trying to process in both of these books, especially his emerging sexuality as it went from Harlem to Greenwich Village to Paris, where he obviously also lived a life as a gay man. Next slide. One other thing I want to talk about in the village was James Baldwin's politics and political evolution, which I'll probably talk about more later. Baldwin, when he was in Harlem, was taken up by a white school teacher named Orilla Miller, who was a leftist, who was in the Communist Party, who began to kind of talk to Baldwin about the meanings of capitalism, socialism, and the meanings of kind of revolution. When he was in the village in the 1940s, he was courted by leftists, including the Trotskyist movement. And he became really good buddies with a man named Stan Weir, who's pictured here on the left, the author of the book on the right, which is a book about working class solidarity. The Calypso had a lot of lefties running around in it. CLR James, probably the most famous Caribbean Marxist of all time, used to come in and out of that place. He was a Trotskyist. Stan Weir was a Trotskyist. Baldwin talks in his memoirs about moving from 1943 to 1948 across the entire spectrum of politics, from Trotskyism to anarchism. And you can see it, and you can see it in his archive. He was reading the newspapers of the Workers' Party, which was Stan Weir's party. He was reading the newspapers of the anarchist press in New York City at this time. And there's a really interesting story that Stan Weir tells about trying really hard to recruit Baldwin to the Workers' Party. And Baldwin says, in effect, you know, Stan, I love you guys, but you know I'm gay and you've never even asked me about it. I kind of wonder if I would fit into your group. And it's a really interesting moment because Baldwin identified as a socialist even through until the 1970s, but he often had this perspective that the American socialist movement didn't necessarily understand completely or get completely what it meant to be a gay Black man in the United States. And so Stan Weir's friendship with him, which was also lifelong, until the 1970s, when Stan Weir was organizing dock workers in California, he would still write to James Baldwin and say, hey, can you send us a letter of support? The workers are ready to go on strike. And Baldwin would do it. Well, one of Baldwin's most endearing qualities to me was his loyalty. He was very loyal to Beaufort Delaney, Stan Weir, Orilla Miller, his childhood teacher, who I mentioned a second ago. They were corresponding and almost up until the time Baldwin died. So he never forgot where he came, even as he was moving through the world into new terrains. Next slide. So in 1948, Baldwin packs up, leaves the village, and goes to Paris. It's an episode in his life which has kind of been heavily documented and well written about. He leaves for a variety of reasons we could talk about later. One of them is to find a good, inexpensive place to live and write. Another is because Black writers are beginning to go to Paris. Another is because he thinks he'll have an easier time as a gay man there. He never fully comes back to the United States after 1948. He buys a house in southern France and dies there in 1987. But he's in and out, and I'll talk more about that. But the other part of his exile that people don't know much about is that he lived off and on for 10 years on Istanbul from 1960 to 1970. And I want to read you a quote here to talk about how Baldwin's travels and living outside of the US opened up new horizons for him. And I think this quote in a way will help us understand why Paris, France, and Istanbul, Turkey became two places that he felt he wanted to live, explore, and even write about. In fact, the novel I'm going to speak about in a minute, called Another Country, he actually finished in Istanbul in 1962. He did a lot of writing there. But when he was in Paris in 1955, he was arrested and accused of stealing a bed sheet. And the police took him in. He hadn't done it. He was put in a French jail. And the first thing he said was, "Everybody in this jail looks like me." And what he meant was they were mostly North African, Tunisian, Moroccan, and Algerian working class boys who, in the middle of the 1950s, were basically like the outlaw subalterns in Paris at this time. It was a really profound experience for him. And the other thing that's happening in 1955, it's the second year of the outbreak of the Algerian Revolution, the anti-colonial struggle against the French, which runs all the way across the time in which Baldwin is in Paris. This is all new to him, right? He grows up deeply understanding and comprehending American racism, but he hadn't been exposed to what we might call the situation of the Arab world until he got to Paris. So this is a quote from a 1972 book I highly recommend, which I think is one of his greatest retrospective, reflective books, called No Name in the Street, about what it meant for him to be living as a Black man among Arabs in Paris in the 50s. He says, "The Arabs were together in Paris, but the American Blacks were alone. I will not say I envied them, the Arabs, for I didn't, and the directness of their hunger or hungers intimidated me, but I respected them. As I began to discern what their history had made of them, I began to suspect somewhat painfully what my history had made of me." Now, by the mid to late 1960s, James Baldwin is fully invested in the Arab liberation struggles around the world, Algeria being the first one. By the late 60s, it's the Palestinian struggle. So this moment of recognition of the Black relationship to the Arab world, the histories of colonialism, which he argues has made us both, is a really profound learning experience, which connects for me the James Baldwin of France and the James Baldwin of Istanbul, which obviously Turkey was a Muslim majority country. And he's living there in the early 1960s at the same time as he's writing about the Nation of Islam in the United States. Many of you have probably read The Fire Next Time, which is his incredibly important best-selling book about Baldwin trying to understand Islam, Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, and why Malcolm X is trying to tell Black Americans, this is the religion you need to get with, because Christianity is the religion of slavery. So even The Fire Next Time is an Istanbul book, if I can put it that way. And this is, to me, I'm trying to go back to my theme of exile here, where these experiences of being outside the US via the gateway of Greenwich Village really allowed him to look back with sort of like a much wider perspective, like an aerial view, as it were, of his own life. Next slide, please. Baldwin comes back to the United States from France in 1956 and 1957, roughly. He comes back because of the outbreak of the Civil Rights Movement. He comes back as a journalist to go south and cover the student nonviolent coordinating sit-ins, to interview Martin Luther King. He writes some absolutely critical reportage essays about the Civil Rights Movement, and he begins to march. While he's back in the US doing this work, he returns to Greenwich Village and moves into the apartment at 81 Horatio Street, where I started. And this is the plaque that in 2015, happily, the Village Preservation put up to commemorate that site. So Baldwin does a lot of important writing and thinking here. He's doing some of his journalistic writing about the South. He's kind of pivoting back and forth between the South and the North, writing articles for The Nation, Esquire, and other publications. He's also furiously trying to finish some of his books. So he's working on Another Country, which again, I'll talk about in a minute, while he's stationed here on Horatio Street. He's multitasking like crazy because he's beginning to become, by the late 50s, one of the most important Black intellectuals in the world. And he's being asked to do a whole lot of things. So this Horatio Street address kind of catches him at a moment when he's cresting and beginning to rise as a writer. And he also makes a whole slew of new friends when he's living on Horatio Street, including Nikki Giovanni, for example, the great, who's a very young poet at the time, who later sits down with him and gives what I think is one of the most important interviews with Baldwin particularly about gender. She is a Black woman, kind of pushing him really hard on his own representation or lack of representation of women in his writing. But that relationship begins at this Horatio Street apartment. So really wonderful, important place. Next slide. So this is the book that I think, if there is a real Greenwich Village novel, it's probably Another Country. I just want to point out one thing. It takes place almost entirely in New York City. Many of the scenes take place in the Village. Some take place in other parts of the city, uptown and downtown. It's very much of a New York novel. There are also some scenes that take place in the American South. Loosely, it's about what would have been called in the late 50s, early 60s, bohemianism. The lead character is a saxophone player named Rufus. There are artists and painters in the novel. It's an extraordinary book about sex. It's really Baldwin looking at the intersections of sex and race in late 50s, early 60s New York City. There's a lot of exploratory sleeping around, cross-racial sleeping. I don't want to give away too many spoilers. And it's a really open meditation for Baldwin on what I think we've kind of come to think of as non-binary, fluid sexuality and fluid racial identity. And I've always been struck by the fact that he called it Another Country, because it seemed to me he was signaling that this place that his protagonist inhabited was almost a country unto itself, where they were sort of exploring taboos and breaking them and crossing boundaries. But it also signals that Baldwin was living in other places when he wrote it. The tagline, when he finally finishes the last page of the book, he writes Istanbul 1962. So he's sitting in his apartment in Istanbul as he finishes this. And yet Another Country is also the United States of America, right? So there's this complicated way in which he's mapping his exiled self onto his native self. His first book is called Notes of a Native Son. Baldwin was often playing around with the notion of nativity, especially as he, moved further and further away from the United States and became a sort of an exiled son. But this is a passage I wanted to read, not from Another Country, which I've tried to describe, but from this really important essay called Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood, published in 1985. If you're interested in gender studies and Baldwin's readings of gender, this is a really important essay. So he says, and he's speaking here now about people on the sexual margins, including gays and lesbians. Freaks are called freaks and are treated in the main abominably because they are human beings who cause to echo deep within us our most profound terrors and desires. But we are all androgynous, not only because we are all born of a woman impregnated by the seed of a man, but because each of us helplessly and forever contains the other, male and female, female and male, white and black and white. We are part of each other. Many of my countrymen appear to find this fact exceedingly inconvenient. He's talking about Americans, and even unfair, and so very often do I, but none of us can do anything about it. It's it's a groundbreaking novel, Another Country, in terms of its willingness to push all of these sexual and racial boundaries. It sold incredibly well. It actually sold better than either of his first two books, which is by itself really important. Um, and then to me, it kind of like laid some of the theoretical foundation for his later writings, like Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood, where he starts to more openly and sort of in expository fashion lay out some of the ideas that he was experimenting with in his fiction. And I think one of the things that I think is that Baldwin tried a whole bunch of things in fiction because they were a little safer. Later on in the 70s and the 80s, as he's asked and given the space to comment more openly on things like queer life, he does it in the form of an essay like this. So I'm a big fan of Another Country. And the last thing I'll say about it is it was also inspired by the death of a really, really close friend named Eugene Wirth, who was a Trotskyist, a young black man who threw himself off the George Washington Bridge when he was about 20 years old. It was really devastating for Baldwin. It's one of the reasons he left the United States. He was in a kind of tailspin about the loss of Eugene Wirth, and he literally replicates this scene through the guise of another character in Another Country. So there are elements of autobiography which are important too. I think I only have one more slide. Next slide. So I'll just come back to my opening theme on Baldwin on exile and freedom. And I hope what I've tried to demonstrate here is that places were important to Baldwin, places like Greenwich Village as incubators, as think tanks, also as new ways to map his thinking and kind of lily pads to leap to other places. In my view, Baldwin never gets to Paris if he doesn't go through the village. He never gets to Istanbul if he doesn't go to Paris. He went to other places like Israel and Africa, which we could talk about too. But that first decision to run from Harlem into downtown New York City at the age of 19 kind of lit a fire under him to continually pursue the possibility that maybe living outside of one's native habitat was really the way to learn and be free. So I end with this quote, which I just like. It's hard not to know which quotes to choose from Baldwin because they're all so extraordinary. But he says, in my case, I think exile saved my life, for it inexorably confirmed something which Americans appear to have great difficulty accepting, which is simply this: a man is not a man until he is able and willing to accept his own vision of the world, no matter how radically this vision departs from others. And for me, the radicalism of James Baldwin is really paramount. And I mean his political interest in things like socialism and anti-colonialism, his willingness to challenge the United States' war in Vietnam, to stand up for Palestinians, to live an openly queer life and to write about it. This was about as radical, I think, as he could have been in his lifetime. But for me, his transitions and movements and mobility were part of the enabling way in which he developed this confidence to really live the life of a radical. So thank you. I'm going to pause there and would love to have conversation and questions and challenges and know what you're all thinking as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. So yeah, folks, as you think of your questions, pop those either into the chat or the Q&A. But I'll go ahead and get started. Now, obviously, James Baldwin is someone that you study on a professional level, but I would be interested to know a little bit more about what brought you to write the book? What inspired you to write the book? What is it that so inspires you about Baldwin to really dive in and study him to this degree?
So I think there's two pieces of that. One is that I have always taught James Baldwin. I taught for 30 years in the university. And actually, when I was in New York teaching at Hunter College as a graduate assistant, I used to teach Baldwin's essays. And I thought they were always models of getting young people to think about how to write. And so, I've always carried him with me as a teacher in the classroom for many, many, many years. In 2012 or 13, when the Trayvon Martin shooting happened and the Black Lives Matter movement emerged, I started going back to read Baldwin again. And one of the reasons is because Baldwin wrote so much about policing in the United States. He wrote this extraordinary essay called Report from an Occupied Territory in 1966, which is the year the Black Panther Party is formed, a year in the next 2 years, we're going to have in Detroit and Newark and St. Louis, all kinds of major urban rebellions. It's the year after the Watts riot. And Baldwin said in 1966 that if you're Black in America, the police are an occupying army in your neighborhood. And he was trying to draw an analogy between American policing and the war in Vietnam, which was also being occupied by the US. But he was trying to argue that the police were part of the structural repression that Black lives experienced on a day-to-day basis. And he was one of the first writers in the United States to start to talk about that. And he published this essay in The Nation magazine, which was a widely read, oftentimes very white magazine. And from 1966 all through the 1970s, Baldwin really focused in on anti-Black violence and anti-Black racism. He was very close friends with Medgar Evers, who was killed by a Klan member in the South in 1963. He was close with Malcolm X when he was assassinated. He was close with Martin Luther King. And by the late 60s, he had become convinced that the police state and the state apparatus were really, really dangerous to Black life. And it seemed to me that that was the main motif of this movement that had broken out in 2013. And in fact, an incredible number of Black writers began to go back to James Baldwin during the Black Lives Matter movement. I think the most famous would be Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote this book, Between the World and Me, about a friend who had been killed by police. And he really modeled it after Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Baldwin's Fire Next Time is dedicated to his nephew, he's basically writing a book about the conditions of race in the world to say, careful boy, this is the world you're entering into. And Ta-Nehisi Coates dedicates his book to his own son, talking about the nature of police violence.
Did we lose him? Just... Oh dear folks, I think we might be having some connectivity issues due to the stormy weather. Let's see if we'll give Professor Mullen a moment to see if he can log back in. Ah, there we go.
I think that, sorry, I think that was my internet that dropped. I apologize.
No, no worries. No worries. We're glad to have you back.
I'm back. I'm sorry. Sorry to go away.
No worries. So you were speaking on Coates and him dedicating his essay to his son, and then that's kind of
Yeah.
where you cut off from there.
Yeah, just that Baldwin became a touchstone for a lot of writers and activists who were trying to interpret and retell the story of police violence in the United States. And it's a recurring theme in his work, and he writes about it really brilliantly. So I think I was invested partly in going back and recovering that part of Baldwin too. I wanted to write about that piece of Baldwin's life.
And And speaking of writers, what is it unique about writers that can bring to the forefront issues that a society is facing, and especially for the fact it seems some of these issues that continue to haunt us today, and what was unique about Baldwin's voice then, but also now continuing on to today?
I mean, I think the wonderful thing about writing is that if you can get something published, you can't really control who's going to read it. So writing is inherently a dangerous thing. In other words, you can say brave, dangerous things on the page, and they'll end up in places that you can never predict. And so it means writing is actually an important, dangerous, potentially dangerous social force to move the world and move people's ideas. And I think that's how Baldwin understood it. Um, I think, you know, most cultures think of their national identities through their writers. They, like we talked about, what is British literature? What is Polish literature? What is American literature? Baldwin wanted to be recognized as an American writer. His first book of essays is called Notes of a Native Son. He's actually making a case that I am both a Black man and an American. And he was trying to position himself as a spokesperson for both the US and for Black life. And he was very successful at it. And I think that that gave him a platform once he had succeeded in doing that to speak. And I think one thing that he was very clever about was once he was established as a writer, Baldwin, for example, appeared in mass media. He was very always looking for opportunities to appear on television. For example, in the 1960s, he debates Malcolm X on television in the early 1960s. He goes on the Dick Cavett show, which was a popular talk show, to talk about race, to talk about the things he was writing about. So for him, I think to be a writer was to be a public intellectual and a public figure. I think he was one of the first writers of the 20th century to fully embrace that concept that the writer was a public figure and an intellectual, and not to shy away from it, but in a way to take advantage of it. So I think those were things that he did particularly well. He was also just one of the great prose stylists of all time. I mean, people still look at Baldwin's essays, and I would include myself in it, as sometimes just absolutely perfectly structured, beautifully argued. There's a kind of eloquence beyond eloquence in Baldwin's work, which is really timeless and very moving. So he was an incredible craftsman and artist as well. And I think all of those things were certainly things that motivated me to want to write about him.
So now we have some questions coming in from the audience. Let me see them here. All right. So we have our first question from Elliot. Are you aware of the new Colm Tobin book on Baldwin? And in an interview, he was asked, how do you think Baldwin would feel about Oprah Winfrey? A question that Eliot perceived as subtextual attempts to gauge how Baldwin would have assessed the neoliberals of today and the way they have co-opted publishing industry and African American novelists of today.
I'm not familiar with that book. Sorry to say. I don't know what Baldwin might have. Baldwin did not shy away from celebrity himself, so I don't know that he would have been bothered by Oprah Winfrey's enormous franchising of herself into a kind of commercial and media empire. He was always wary of people, though, who he felt, whether they were Black or white or other, who he perceived to be mainly entrepreneurs or opportunists, and people who once they became successful, would abandon their sense of social justice. In fact, another way I interpret his exile to France and Istanbul, He left America just about the time he started to get really famous. And he said, if I stay back here, I'm going to fall into that trap. I'm going to become celebrity James Baldwin. And he felt that that would, in effect, be a de-authentication of himself, that it would kind of tempt him to abandon his working class, poor Harlem roots, his constant attempts to understand the world from the people at the bottom of the world, not at the top of the world. And I suspect that part of Baldwin might have looked at Oprah Winfrey and said, oh, I don't want that. He didn't want that. What Baldwin did with his own money many times was give it away. He bought a wonderful apartment for his mother in New York City just to take care of her. He had 8 siblings. He took care of them. He sent, when Malcolm X was assassinated, he sent Betty Shabazz a big check, and she said, I'll never forget that. So it's kind of a long answer to the question. But for me, that kind of celebrity and wealth and fame was never what Baldwin would have been after.
Next question is, was there a connection between James Baldwin and Bayard Rustin? And yeah, and maybe if you could talk a little bit more about Baldwin's lasting impact on queer liberation and LGBT, especially, with Stonewall being in the village as well. And what did Baldwin have thoughts on that?
Yeah, really, really great questions. He knew Bayard Rustin, and they were friendly. They were not close. Uh, Bayard Rustin, as many people know, was one of the primary organizers of the March on Washington, working closely with King. He was also, because he was disclosed as a gay man, very much marginalized in that movement, even by King himself, who tried to put distance between himself and Rustin. Baldwin certainly could have understood and appreciated that. Uh, Baldwin was surveilled by the FBI starting in 1960. They commented frequently on his own homosexuality. It was one of the things that made him dangerous. Eldridge Cleaver attacked him as a gay man, said he was basically selling out and sodomizing himself to the white man. Eldridge Cleaver of the Black Panther Party. So he and Rustin had a kind of symbolic connection, I would argue, in the early 60s as two of the most prominent Black men on the left who were both gay and were both stigmatized and who both suffered for their sexuality. Um, I think that's how I would answer that. Baldwin's legacy for queer life in America, I think, is impossible to contain or describe. It is just vast. And I mean, um, everything from writing Giovanni's Room in 1956, intimating homoeroticism and Go Tell It on the Mountain in 1953, writing essays in the 1960s. He's even writing in the New York Post, essays about the phobias that Americans have about bisexuality and homosexuality. He's so far ahead of his time. It's hard to appreciate. And then I think another wave of this importance is, at least in the university, Baldwin is really an important figure in sort of Black queer studies, right? One of the first important books that comes out about Baldwin as a gay Black writer was edited by Dwight McBride, and it's a collection of essays that came out, I want to say, in the late 1980s, that really opened up kind of Black queer studies in a serious way, along with a lot of other work. So in the academy, I would argue his legacy is really, really critical as well. And then I think, the number of gay and lesbian writers he may have inspired is almost impossible uh, to wrap our heads around. I mean, I will say one thing about Baldwin. You asked about Stonewall. I looked really hard. Baldwin didn't really say much about Stonewall. He was in France when Stonewall happened. He was in and out of the US in the 1970s. If readers are interested, or your viewers are interested, he did a series of interviews with Richard Goldstein for the Village Voice in 1984, which were published as a book. And there's some of the most explicit sort of self-commentaries he makes about what it feels like to him to be an openly gay man, also during the HIV crisis, which he doesn't write about very much, although he did lose a lover to HIV in France. And his last play, which is called The Welcome Table, which has never been published, has a reference to HIV. But Baldwin in the 80s was kind of a reluctant warrior for queer liberation. I mean, Goldstein asks him directly, what do you think is your place in the movement? He says, well, I'm not even sure I've ever been fully comfortable with the word gay, which in 1984 would have been sort of, lingua franca. And it's complicated for him, I think. He he liked his privacy, and I think part of him wanted his sexuality to remain private, kind of private business. He also kind of, I think, was reluctant to be stigmatized or stigmatizing of others, because he had this sense that sexuality was a kind of a practice, not necessarily a category of expression. He says you go the way your blood beats, is the way he described sexual desire. So what I would sort of argue is that a lot of the things, his novels, the essays like Freaks, are really theoretically rich places for all of us to comprehend queerness, non-normativity, non-binary life, everything. It's an ongoing project, and I think we'll spend the next couple of 100 years learning more from Baldwin about sexuality.
Let's see, other question. Can you comment on Baldwin's essay, Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, and how close it was to how he lived or interacted in his own life?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and important essay, and I feel like I could talk for a long time about it, but let me answer briefly. Um, that essay is Baldwin trying to do two things. He's trying to both express his condemnation of anti-Semitism and personally, and to explain how and why in some oppressed communities people become anti-Semites. And one of the things he's arguing is that in Black neighborhoods like Harlem, when Black folks see Jewish merchants, for example, or Jewish businessmen opening businesses in Harlem and making money, they can sort of become anti-Semitic in their response. They're like, why them? Why are they prospering and we're not? And he argues in the essay that for some oppressed folks, this is the way the Jews start to become white. They become part of the establishment, right? And what he really means is the capitalist order of things, like the system that is a class society with Black folks largely inhabiting the bottom and white folks largely inhabiting the top. So I think it's a really nuanced essay, um, which is trying to place American racism and anti-Semitism in a longer history of capitalist social relationships. And what I would say to people who are interested in Baldwin and the question of anti-Semitism, um, his early life is really marked by friendships with Jews on the American left. He learns American racism partly by seeing the anti-Semitism that they're subject to. One of his closest friends is a guy named Saul Stein, who helps him get published. Later on in his life, after he goes to um, Israel, after he goes to Paris, and in the 1960s, he begins to develop a critical view of Zionism as a political ideology. He begins to argue that Zionism is actually a colonial ideology, and he comes to that position partly by having been to Israel and seen the condition that Palestinians are living under, and also seeing, going back to my point about the Arab world, understanding the plight of Arabs in the Middle East in a more comprehensive fashion. So Baldwin was, throughout his life, both very committed to fighting anti-Semitism and also a critic of Zionism, and also a friend and ally of Arab liberation struggles. And I add all that because it's a kind of a through line of my book. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write it also was because in the US, the question of Palestine is for a lot of people very fraught. And Baldwin, I think, is one of the best students of the history of Zionism and also the understanding of um, how Palestinians can be perceived as a colonized people and an indigenous colonized people in their own homeland. So that's a more than the question asked, but I wanted to add that.
And before I ask our final question for the evening and let everyone go, I do want to mention, I put it in the chat earlier, Pluto Press, the publisher of Bill's book, James Baldwin, Living in Fire, has very kindly offered a discount code to purchase his book. So if you go to plutobooks.com, look up James Baldwin, Living in Fire, and use the code Mullen 30. So that's MULLEN 30. You will get 30% off Bill's book. All right, I just wanted to make sure I got that in there before I let everyone go. But for our final question this evening, if James Baldwin were here now, what might he say to the young people of the US and really around the world today?
That's such a great question. I'll answer it by saying, by giving people a couple things to look at. Baldwin always argued that the youth, the young generation, and that children were not only the future, but the hope of the world, including the United States. And he came to that conclusion having grown up poor and Black himself and fought through it and got out and made a complicated, wonderful life for himself. He also came to that conclusion by watching the civil rights movement unfold and seeing school children in the South fight to integrate their own schools. He really understood that the youth as a political force and as a political power. What he said about himself when he was about 40 when the civil rights movement took off. He said, I'm old, I'm the old guard. He said, these kids are way more courageous than I was when I was their age. And he was talking about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee kids, the kids who were doing the lunch counter sit-ins in the South, the kids who were facing the water hoses. He said, they are brave and they are the future. And my own sense is that that's what Baldwin would ask of our youth today. He would say they have to be bold and brave and fearless. They have to use their education to their best advantage. He was a big proponent of schooling and public schooling. He said, my life was changed, he said, by the public library. I mean, I just read my way out of the ghetto, is really the way he put it. And he constantly conveyed that message to young people when he spoke to them. And he made a special point of doing that. He's in the early 60s, he went around the country talking to youth groups for CORE, which was the Congress of Racial Equality. There's a wonderful film that people can go online and watch called Take This Hammer. He went to San Francisco in 1963. It's a TV broadcast. He just walked around talking to young Black men in San Francisco about what their lives were like. So for him, Black, not just Black youth, young people generally, he thought were tremendously important. And he thought in America, they were treated really, really badly. He really felt like the US was a society that infantilized its adults and kind of brutalized its children. He gave a talk in the early 60s called A Talk to Teachers. He went to a Harlem public school and he said, you have a tremendous responsibility to tell your students that the world that hates them is a world that can be resisted. You have to convey to them that they have to fight, they have to be willing to struggle. So I really like the question because James Baldwin wrote a book for children too. I should mention that, called Little Man Tate. And it's actually about his nieces and nephews. He never had his own children, but his siblings did. and it's available from Duke University Press. It's a storybook. It's illustrated. It's a book about three children growing up in Harlem. I think it gives you he wrote that book because he wanted those children to be role models for the children who would read the book. So there's a lot of nice traces of James Baldwin's what he would say to children now, I think, in the record that he left behind.
Bill, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, taking the time to answer our questions, for writing your book. So again, everyone, go to plutobooks.com, look up James Baldwin Living in Fire, and use the code Mullen 30. But thank you again, Bill. This was really, really wonderful. I think you've inspired all of us to go first read your book and then go and read some more James Baldwin, especially to mark the centenary of his birth that just happened last Friday. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We will send the links to the publisher to buy Bill's book in that follow-up email with the code. But Bill, a big thank you. Thank you, everyone. Stay dry in the stormy weather for those of you here in New York. And I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, William.
Take care.